Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Parker. I'm the Associate Dean for External Affairs, and I have the great privilege of serving as the inaugural director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. And on behalf of the Brown School and Washington University, I'd like to welcome you to Open Classroom. First, I just want to acknowledge that these are very difficult and challenging times, and that we hope that everyone is safe and healthy, and that your families are in our thoughts. And we hope that this is an opportunity here at the Open Classroom to be able to have an opportunity at some professional development, or even kind of dive into a topic that you may not know anything about or are curious about. And so we're very, very pleased to have you join us today. And I would like to, first thank and introduce the director of the Office of Professional Development. She has been pulling these together, and thankfully our faculty have been very anxious and excited to be able to share their expertise with you. So with that, please give a warm Brown School welcome to Janet Gillow.
Thanks, Gary. You all are in for a treat today in Open Classroom. Welcome, and we're so delighted you're here. Despite the somber times and indeed a somewhat somber topic, you're going to hear from three of my favorite colleagues who are presenting to you today on school-based mental health, helping parents manage their child's anxiety, and taking us back to the basics with that. The fantastic panel that we have includes Ryan Lindsay, who is an associate professor of the practice, assistant dean for social work at the Brown School. Ryan's clinical expertise is in the assessment and treatment of a wide variety of mental health conditions, and his practice research focuses on enhancing school capacity to implement suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention policies and practices. We also have with us Megan Marietta. She's the manager of social work services for the St. Louis Public Schools. She has extensive experience in the assessment and treatment of youth with mental health conditions, in addition to significant experience and expertise in addressing policy-related issues impacting public schools. And finally, Erica Gonzalez, who's the Brown School's manager of urban education initiatives. She has extensive experience as a school social worker. She's also been a classroom teacher, and she builds community partnerships brokered around enhancing equity for educational experiences. Each of them has a unique perspective in coming together really strong ideas and guidance they can give us on what we can do to support parents as they support children in these difficult times. So with that, I turn it over to the panel. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Janet and Gary. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ryan Lindsay, and I'm an associate professor of practice at the Brown School, but also licensed clinical social worker. I'd like to thank each of you for providing the critical support for so many of our kids and families in our communities. As we all know, schools are the primary source of mental health resources for youth, and I know that each of you are working tirelessly to address the multitude of mental health challenges of students, even as I speak to you probably right now. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Brown School's Open Classrooms format for providing free and accessible professional development during these unprecedented times. Never more in the history of my career in social work do I feel our professional competencies are needed, and this is just one more way to access important information to help us to be more effective in our work. Our schools are microcosms of our communities and provide essential concrete and social supports for kids and families, and we recognize that this pandemic has created significant challenges to meeting these needs. To this end, I want to acknowledge that a webinar of this type has limitations in its capacity to disseminate all the information that is needed to address all the needs of our school systems and communities. However, we do hope that today's presentation will provide inspiration for your work and your efforts to implement interventions to support youth and families. Before we get started, I want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, that it is an open forum with no assumptions of confidentiality. And so I ask that any information provided in the chat not contain any personally identifying information to ensure we preserve the confidentiality of our students and families. As you follow along with today's presentation, I encourage you to use the chat function to share information, resources, or even ask questions. Our moderators will help to organize the Q&A at the end of the presentation. All right. So given existing stay-at-home orders, local public health and social distancing recommendations, and school closures, Most school-based mental health professionals have had to pivot and integrate telemental health strategies into their service delivery system. For many, this is a brand new experience. For others, this wasn't that big of a lift. Either way, the personal pivot combined with the legal and ethical considerations of providing services via a method that is unfamiliar requires significant considerations to ensure that our services continue to uphold standards of confidentiality, legal mandates regarding the consent to provide mental health services that include telehealth, and considerations of specific telehealth platforms. From a clinical perspective, we're probably going to need to revisit existing treatment goals to determine the clinical relevancy, given the stay-at-home orders. For some families, the treatment focus will need to change. The treatment plan may solely shift to focusing on management of anxiety. Additionally, it's critical that safety plans are updated to ensure any modifications based on location, triggers, and specific coping is addressed inside those safety plans. Most importantly, for school-based mental health providers, clinicians need to have that emergency contact information on hand in a way that is accessible given our work from home. So I think that is important that we remind ourselves that we already have the training, experience, and competencies to help our youth and families manage the anxiety that is arising during this time. We know what we need to do. We already know what helps kids flourish. We know the strategies that help reduce vulnerabilities to negative emotional experiences. So let's get back to basics to set the stage for today's webinar. When we boil down all the research on nourishing youth development, we know that if we focus on 3 things, we have the capacity to promote powerful pathways to bring about healthy outcomes in our youth. To the extent that we are trying to help youth and families reduce vulnerabilities to experiencing anxieties or helping youth with existing anxiety disorders cope during these times, we need to start with the basics. Therefore, community, relational, and individual level interventions that focus on supporting stable and responsive relationships, building safe and supportive environments, and ensuring appropriate nutrition should characterize our work. These 3 buckets of protective factors can serve as a focus of a wide range of interventions that can help support our families to manage the anxiety that is a normative part of experiencing adversity in a unique way. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Children, Youth, and Families has outlined an extremely useful conceptual model that can help us think about how to support families and caregivers during this time. This framework provides opportunities to respond at multiple levels in service of promoting resilience in the face of the pandemic, not only during the immediate phase of the pandemic, but also following the ripple effects that this pandemic will have on our communities. The immediate anxiety of adjusting to a new situation, which by this time may actually be in our rearview mirrors, and the need to be thinking about how to support our families over the long run need to be on our radars. I think that it's important to understand that our job is not to erase anxiety or fear. For many, these anxieties and fear are very justified. For many of our families living in many of our communities, especially for families of color and socioeconomically vulnerable families, these are justifiably frightful times. So I think we need to orient ourselves to what our task is in helping. We are trying to help our families fare better in school, work, and life. Our job is not to eliminate these feelings, but to help to understand they can both have these emotions and they can manage them over time. The Children's Bureau focused on 3 primary levels of community intervention: cultivating positive school environments, maximizing positive community environments, and enhancing economic opportunities for everyone. Our school environments protect children. Schools are the cornerstone of the primary source of access to school-based mental health services and other programs specifically designed to enhance research-backed protective factors for youth. These protective factors are shown to lead to positive mental health and physical health outcomes. However, in the midst of a pandemic, many of our youth have lost many of the supports that help promote healthy development. Moreover, the very loss of these supports may be a primary contributor to increased levels of vulnerability and anxiety for many. We are all aware of the role that school mental health professionals play in bridging these environments in the midst of stay-at-home orders and social distancing mandates. This may mean that what structures were put into place may have to be retooled, and I'm fully aware that school stakeholders are working tirelessly to translate this support in the face of significant challenges. The school district's response during this crucial time represents a key leverage point to enhance community, familial, caregiver, and youth resiliency. We have an opportunity to engage in innovative models of bridging the positive school environment into our communities in ways never before seen. Of course, typically a task of this nature requires substantial lead time to adequately prepare prior to implementing. However, real world and practice-based wisdom is leading the charge as school districts, school social workers, and other school stakeholders are learning as we go. Many of the best practices that will come out of our communities of practice are still to be determined, which makes this task even more overwhelming. This said, we are already learning a lot from this experience, and these learnings will translate into standards of preparedness and responses in our future. At this point, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Megan Marietta, Manager of Social Work Services at St. Louis Public Schools, to speak to how one school district is building on the strengths of their district and families to support the educational support missions of their districts.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. So as mentioned, I manage social work services at St. Louis Public Schools. We are a school district of just under 22,000 students enrolled in grades preschool through 12th. And although we are no longer the largest district in the region in terms of enrollment, we are in terms of sites. We have 72 school buildings across the city. Our district qualifies for 100% free and reduced lunch, and 25% of our students have been identified as living in transition under the McKinney-Vento Act. So that means that these students lack regular fixed nighttime residence. St. Louis leads the nation for homicides per ratio, and the summer of 2019 marked the beginning of a wave of gun violence with children falling victim. Our district, St. Louis Public Schools, experienced the death of 8 children in just a matter of a few months, and the violence continued throughout the year. Supporting our families does not come without significant challenges. So these challenges make it difficult for our families and students to receive needed services, increases the anxiety of school stakeholders as barriers to connecting and engaging continue to exist with many of the most vulnerable families, and there continues to be significant threats to the safety and well-being of many children in our community. In the absence of the primary workforce of mandated reports leading to the identification and referral of children suspected to be experiencing child abuse and neglect, our school stakeholders are under significant stress, leading to their own levels of anxiety rising. Additionally, this will be a significant challenge we must be prepared to address upon the return to schools in the fall. And there's a very real potential of overwhelming our child welfare system with an influx of mandated reports. So this year we were tasked with creating a new school year. In April. This is generally a time when students and families are preparing, as well as staff, for MAP testing, year-end activities, graduation, commencement ceremonies, field days. This year was a little bit different, as students and staff are beginning to daydream about summer vacation plans. We were tasked and charged with creating a new school year. A school year that was technology-based, one that we had never done before. This really highlighted for our district many of the challenges that other districts in the area were not faced with. We first had to start off with acquiring enough technology to support our students in distance learning. From there, we had to create a plan. How do we get professional development rolled out to staff? How do we actually deliver this equipment to students and families when we have to follow physical distancing rules? We created a plan and yet had to be flexible enough on a daily basis to be able to pivot and adjust to any new developments from COVID-19 almost on a daily basis. And with that, we did see some of these challenges. We see that not all students are engaged in this distance learning. For many staff, the instant worry was about their students, and more specifically, their neediest students, those who are often absent, those who struggle academically, or those who they know are the victims of child abuse and neglect. Thoughts of, I miss my students, and will their parents be able to help them at home? And the frustrations of technology, not knowing how to work the equipment or it not working at various times, are really all too common thoughts of school staff members. Physical distancing makes it difficult for our families and students to receive needed services, which increases the anxiety of school stakeholders as barriers to connecting and engaging continue to exist with many of our most vulnerable families. And there continues to be significant threats to the safety and well-being of many children in our community. We must be prepared to address upon the return to school, again, this overwhelming sense of anxiety and influx in these mandated reporting systems. So in an effort to reduce our anxiety for students and families, SLPS immediately provided families with free meals on a daily basis at numerous sites throughout the city. However, due to increased exposure to COVID-19 for food services staff, food distribution has been limited to once per week. Families are supplied with meal kits for a family of 7 throughout the entire week. We also implemented a district helpline to assist in meeting the social and emotional needs of our students and families. And district therapists quickly converted to telehealth services, while social workers and school counselors are also utilizing technology-based platforms to connect with students. So whether they are joining teaching staff on Zoom or Teams calls, creating their own website on the school site, or also just sending families a video text saying, we miss you and what can we do? Call if you need anything. We've also seen staff reach out to families via parades past their homes, just sending them messages of support and hope and letting them know that they are missed. Staff have already commented about how much easier it has been to connect with the families with whom they've already had an existing relationship with, that they are seeing a difference in those families being engaged, not only in just communicating with them socially, but also with their children engaged, being engaged academically during this time of physical distance. And that is one piece of what we are doing to plan moving forward, that staff have already realized that the relationship piece needs to begin at the beginning of the next school year, including more phone calls home to offer praises of success, collaboration amongst school staff to identify student and family needs, and a real concerted effort to engage more caregivers in the school community. So in this midst of implementing this brand new school year, this technology-based learning year, we are already adjusting our sites onto next school year. So conversations about how do we recognize the shared experience of quarantine and the losses associated with it, those conversations have already started. We've already begun to ask ourselves, what supports do we need to offer our students and staff on the first day of school? How will we adjust to this new norm? Do we even know what our new norm will be? And what practices have emerged from this experience that we want to be sure to continue even after we aren't physically distant anymore? And although we don't have all of these answers, we know that we have to do something, that the start of next school year has to be different from every other year prior. Our partnerships with our community-based mental health agencies have already been secured for next year and preparing for higher student need. Our school social workers and counselors will be trained in resilience and coping intervention to ensure available services to students and families and staff on the first day of school. We've already decided that a district leader will be assigned to each school site to serve as an ambassador, that they will offer support, that they will be the bridge to the district office from the school, and that in hopes that that will all reduce stress and anxiety. And as I mentioned, the relationship building piece. That is one piece that we are seeing not only with families, but also amongst staff themselves. So for example, I'm not supposed to pull school social workers together for meetings or professional development on any day that's not marked as a professional development day. It never dawned on me last year that we should and could connect via Zoom or a Teams call. So that is something that we will be implementing next year as a social work department as well, that there are ways for us to stay connected, to offer support, to be a resource to one another without having to have physical contact. And the same is very true for our families, to have those phone calls from a supportive lens, getting back to the social work basics of reaching out to say, hey, how are you? Hi, I'm the school social worker. Is there anything that I can do to help? Rather than just phone calls about attendance concerns or academics or behavior concerns. So as our planning continues, we will look to identify resources and supports that are necessary to reduce the vulnerability of everyone in the school community. That includes our staff as well.
And thinking about moving, when we're thinking about managing anxiety, we have to understand that we have to address community level supports in order to reduce vulnerabilities to the development of anxiety. So we start with community, and now we move on to one of the critical cornerstones of how we can help families is focusing on relationships. Supporting families and youth manage anxiety centers enhancing caregiver competencies to not only assist youth in managing heightened anxiety, but also help caregivers manage their own anxiety in the face of the pandemic. Many of our families are experiencing significant adversity: loss of loved ones, loss of freedom, loss of jobs, and other forms of stability. Loss leads to a sense of vulnerability for anyone. For school-based mental health professionals, this is an opportunity to return to the basics and orient parents and caregivers of the importance of parenting basics. Often when faced with novel situations, we get disoriented, and rather than returning to what we know works, we seek out some new innovative strategy to address the situation. However, if we just remind ourselves that we already know what is helpful and return to the basics, then we can work on applying existing strategies to a new situation rather than reinventing the wheel. We know that if we don't have the foundations to buffer against magnifying existing anxiety, that it will be very difficult to reduce anxiety in anyone beyond that. Let's remind ourselves what we do know about child coping. How parents respond to stressors is much more important than the stressor itself in determining outcomes. It is important that we attend to caregiver process, their ability to self-regulate in the face of adversity, and focus on their strengths. In the absence of these characteristics, children and youth struggle to feel safe, and this may simply add to their sense of vulnerability. Vulnerability here is defined as equating to perceived threats to safety, security, or integrity. Anxiety is the natural consequence to these contexts. It is normal. This can serve as permission of sorts to focus on caregiver coping first. If we don't help the caregiver put their own oxygen mask on, then it will be very difficult to help the kiddo experiencing anxiety. I'm suggesting that returning to the basics of effective parenting can get us further in the long run. This is an experience that will roll out in phases. We are likely over the initial jolt as stay-at-home orders have been in place for many weeks. Many homes have found some semblance of a new normal, even if the new normal is precarious. As restrictions and broader economic conditions of the pandemic hits our communities, we enter into a new, yet to be defined phase that will have ripple effects well into the future. Where once fear may have dominated the emotional experiences of youth, and particularly caregivers, many are now transitioning into a sense of anxiety, amplified by the uncertainty that awaits our nation and our globe. To return the foundation or the basics, we can focus on the essential elements that are needed to help buffer the impact of a unique and unprecedented experience. We are all likely familiar with these strategies of effective parenting. These parenting basics emphasize exploration, understanding clear limits, and flexibility with fair and consistent discipline. Applied to enhancing caregiver capacity to help their child manage anxiety, these principles are extremely salient. Our interventions with families need to return to these principles. We need to gently remind caregivers to stop, attend, and listen to their child, help our caregivers not forget to prompt their children to talk, express themselves, and put into words or visual representations what they are thinking, feeling, and wanting to do. We need to gently remind caregivers to encourage their children to engage in independent problem solving. However, during times of stress, it is normal for children, and adults for that matter, to regress and wish to have those around them solve their problems for them, and this is often experienced as important comfort and nurturance. We also understand that it is best to encourage active problem solving, even if it means holding their hand again while simultaneously encouraging their kiddos to do something scary. We can take appropriate precautions that reduce risks. We need to teach our children that precautions are about keeping ourselves and others safe, but precautions shouldn't preclude youth from exploring within reason. Finally, we need to gently remind caregivers to validate the internal thoughts and feelings. However, equally as important, encourage youth to engage in developmentally appropriate problem solving, encouraging the exploration of multiple ways to solve problems, asking, what can we do to feel less anxious? Getting caregivers to see themselves as coaches that model these strategies is a critically important first step in the treatment planning process. Fundamental to helping youth manage anxiety is helping caregivers help their children. Often this is adopting the role of a coach. This, of course, is easier said than done. However, research shows the effectiveness of taking this approach. Coaches teach new skills, encourage youth, reinforce their efforts, motivate them to keep working towards their goals, and help guide them. As a caregiver, the same framing can be quite helpful. For the provider, understanding caregiver values and how these translate to existing parental philosophies is critically important. I found that if I can explore caregiver values and identify specific values the caregiver is hoping to teach their children, I am much better positioned to offer an alternative parenting strategy or approach, while simultaneously maintaining the priorities and autonomy of caregiver decision-making. However, this is all predicated on the idea that caregivers possess the skills necessary to model anxiety management, instill hope in their child, and to name, express, and problem solve their responses. We may have to focus a substantial amount of our treatment plan to enhancing caregiver capabilities in the service of helping youth to manage anxiety. When we think about the individual level, the school setting serves as a critical access point for services. This access point has shifted. The work we do to engage a wide range of youth at risk for developing mental health issues and those already impacted by mental health conditions often focuses on assessment of needs and corresponding interventions designed to address those needs. Best practices in child behavioral health tell us that two major categories should be addressed by the interventions we offer youth. These include interventions that enhance self-regulation skills, in other words, emotional and behavioral regulation, and problem solving. The first category, self-regulation, targets student understanding of their emotional experiences. For example, enhancing emotional literacy by helping students recognize physiological, emotional, cognitive, behavioral patterns that relate to discrete emotional experiences. Additionally, this includes helping students understand the range and variance of the intensity of these emotional responses. When youth can name their experiences, they are better able to inhibit impulsive actions. In turn, this gives students important information for how to solve the problem later. This helps to build a sense of mastery and competence that will aid them in their sense of self-efficacy over time, specifically in relationship to anxiety-provoking situations. Finally, the benefits of enhancing emotional literacy is precision and problem solving over time. I might say we all might use a little boost to our own emotional literacy, emotion regulation, and problem solving capabilities right now. I think it's important that we remind ourselves about the functional nature and evolutionary benefit of anxiety and fear. Both of these emotional states function to help protect us from lurking danger or imminent danger. Anxiety is a normative response to increased levels of stress. Anxiety zeroes in on potential vulnerabilities or threats to our sense of safety in the world. This may be economic or physical in nature. This may include threats to long-term plans. This may simply include changes in the environment that are not in a person's control. Additionally, this may center around a sense of uncertainty. Anxiety refers to the cognitive, behavioral, and affective responses to anticipated threats. This is future-oriented. Anxiety functions to prepare us for the potential for danger, initiating planning, problem solving, and other efforts to neutralize or reduce the impact of a lurking threat. Often this is associated with muscle and body tension, worry, and avoidance behaviors. Fear, on the other hand, is a discrete emotional response to immediate perceived threats. Fear activates the fight, flight, or freeze responses and associated with escape behaviors. This may include physiological responses that include our sympathetic nervous system firing to prepare for action. Sometimes our emotional regulation system can be overwhelmed and lead to panic attacks. Both anxiety and fear are associated with a wide range of mental health conditions. However, during a pandemic, anxiety and fear are justified in certain contexts. There is a threat lurking. There are very real losses happening in our lives, in the lives of individuals in our communities. We have families that are disproportionately impacted based on geography, especially for many communities of color, whereby this pandemic is highlighting the historical and current disparities caused by institutional, structural, and systemic racism. As school-based mental health professionals, we also have to be sensitive to real danger that exists for some families and the relatively lower risk of danger for many other families. The privilege of many socioeconomically advantaged youth compared to those socioeconomically disadvantaged peers is significant. We must recognize these factors, constraining some and not others. This creates a level of anxiety that is extremely complicated. The hardest hit industries include service industry, which disproportionately impacts people living in poverty. Moreover, combating these this is a sense of compounding this is a sense of hopelessness that may arise, knowing their voices are not being heard or seriously considered, and in other cases being systematically blocked from being heard. These and many other differences in community impact are critically important to understand. This also means interventions that may work for some may fail to work for others. So what can we do about this? First, we begin by following a set of principles articulated by Harvard Center for the Developing Child. These specific principles should guide our practice in amplifying resilience in caregivers and their youth. These principles highlight the importance of the relationship with a trusted and caring adult, focuses on enhancing a sense of self-efficacy by shifting a person's focus away from the things they cannot control, i.e. how long the stay-at-home orders and social distancing will be a part of our lives, to those things we can control. Sleep routines, eating routines, play routines, positive family interactions, and coping statements they say to themselves. Additionally, we need to focus on engaging some member of the family unit to help the students implement what we are targeting in our one-on-one work. Finally, maximizing the natural resiliency of families and communities requires centering faith, hope, and cultural traditions and affiliations in our work. These historical, community, and familial strategies can be leveraged over time to overcome the adversity of their experiences. This is not the first crisis for many families. We should focus on their inherent capabilities to bounce back over time. When we think about setting the standard, we need to think about also reducing vulnerabilities. In order to reduce emotional vulnerability to anxiety, there are some common parenting practices and methods for structuring the environment that are known to be extremely helpful in buffering against the onset or the amplification of anxiety and fear. I like to think about these strategies as ways to reduce our biological vulnerability to experiencing negative emotional states, such as anxiety, as well as structural ways to institute predictability and consistency into our lives. We all know these are pretty standard practices, but I urge you not to underestimate their short and long-term capacity to buffer the impact of anxiety on youth and families long-term. In a time with significant uncertainty, working on enhancing family capacity to implement these strategies gives them significant control over their present lives now. I would also like to highlight the very real disparities that exist in many communities that lead to challenges in accessing both internal and environmental resources to successfully implement some or all of these strategies. However, our goal is not 100%. Our goals center on enhancing family capability through the implementation of what is reasonable and accessible. Our other job is to either empower our families to find solutions on their own, or in some cases, remove the barriers ourselves. Finally, anxiety-specific strategies that help students and families cope with anxiety now include categories of awareness, emotional literacy, and coping or problem solving. The highlighted links in this slide take you to resources that can help you dig into these strategies in more specific ways. We start by providing education about anxiety and fear, what it is, what it isn't, how it is helpful in certain contexts. For example, anxiety helps us prepare and avoid danger. What makes it unhelpful? For example, is anxiety or fear too high, causes us to freeze, interferes with important goals, or simply doesn't change the danger or makes us more vulnerable. The task here is to help students and youth identify what anxiety feels like in their bodies, what thoughts are attached to these emotional states, and most importantly, the action urge that accompanies these experiences. When it comes to anxiety, when it comes to fear, we're talking about avoidance, escape, and reassurance seeking. We can teach progressive muscle relaxation techniques to help students and caregivers recognize the difference in their body between a relaxed state of being or a threat stance, or being braced for harm. This helps students and caregivers bring awareness to the differences between these states in their body. And if our body is braced for a fight, this signals our brain and corresponding threat system to get prepared. This perpetuates the affective state of anxiety. We can alternatively signal to our brains that we are safe by changing our bodily responses. Progressive muscle relaxation is one strategy to tell our brains we are safe. Other positive coping strategies might include developing specific coping statements, naming the thought and anxiety thought, or sometimes just noticing thoughts as a process our brain engages in. Problem solving might include strategies to help reduce vulnerabilities, strategies to promote self-soothing, or other coping means. All these can be brought together on a coping plan that can be co-developed with caregivers or with youth, depending on how old they are. Sometimes you might create one for caregivers and one for youth. Regardless, it is important to provide a roadmap for them to practice. Learning new responses under novel contexts requires learning strategies that help them engage in intentional practice. Remember, there's no better strategy to fight generalized anxiety than our own selves. Obviously, this varies by developmental age and underscores the importance of helping caregivers model anxiety management even in the face of adversity. And that is our content for today. I'd love to thank my team members, Erica Gonzalez for her contributions to shaping this presentation, Megan Marietta for being an amazing thought partner and community partner, and ever so committed to the safety and well-being of SLPS students, and Maddie Lindsay, my MSWA practicum student who spent significant effort putting together a very useful resource document that is linked at the next slide. And I would like to open this up to questions. Erica is going to help field some questions here.
Ryan, Megan, thank you so much for the content so far. We're getting thank yous and very good comments into the chat. One thing that you raised is, I'm going to try to paraphrase this question, that anxiety is to a certain extent appropriate in this context where there is something to be afraid of. If someone is trying to coach a parent about what is appropriate information sharing, given the age of various children, is there any commentary you can offer about the role of how much information is appropriate information for kids?
Yeah, and I think it all developmentally depends on what is the most appropriate to share. What my rule of thumb is this: we don't want to pretend like everything is rosy and everything is perfect. We want to be able to acknowledge that things are hard, things are scary, and there's uncertainty in the world. And simultaneously presenting oneself in a context of saying that, but we're going to get through this. Whatever that is, we're going to be able to rise to this challenge. And I know that it's scary and I don't have all the answers. And actually, it's really okay not to have all the answers. I think a part of this is being able to communicate the idea that even in the face of not knowing, we actually can survive this.
Very helpful. Okay, so for folks who are with us on the Zoom call, please feel free to use that chat function to raise your questions. Another thing that came up in the conversation was the importance of positive peer relationships for kids in this environment where they cannot safely interact the way they did. What suggestions or what are you seeing is particularly effective?
Yeah, I think I'll answer, and maybe some of my panelist colleagues can also jump in, but I think in general, we want to be able to, I mean, it's a new way of connecting. And I think the scheduling of peer connections, using some of these devices that we have to be able to connect, virtually, but also I think there are ways in which social distancing measures allow for a semblance of hanging out that you just have to get really super creative about. And I don't know if Megan or if Erica has any better strategies around that. No.
Okay, so we have a question from Momo, who's an MSW in training, asking about thoughts. How do we support families who are also dealing with systemic racism in this moment, compounding issues? What thoughts can you share?
Yeah, and I think it's the same way we support families in all contexts when they're experiencing racism. This context is ripe for amplifying the historical context of racism and also highlighting the disparities in symptomology as well as access to care and limitations in these spaces. So I think the idea here is that we're not going to try there isn't a magical intervention that helps to buffer the compounding effects of what systemic racism does in our communities, but we can show ourselves and show up in consistent ways, provide supports, go above and beyond in certain contexts to show that we are here to help connect and we are here to help listen. And we also recognize that this is harder for certain families than other families. And so I wish there was a specific intervention that is going to say, absolutely, this is going to help buffer that. And many of our families are used to buffering this space, and that's not the fair statement. The context is whether or not do we have the supports ongoing to assure that we can support families from every community.
So we're getting questions about whether the slides and resources are going to be shared, and I think a little bit of curiosity also about what's contained in those resources. If you could take a minute and let people know what they're going to be getting.
Yeah. So in the resource document has a whole host of telemental health best practices, a whole host of strategies and resources around helping to engage with students in new and novel ways. There's a whole host of resources for school-based mental health in general, but also how to respond and ensure that suicide prevention efforts still continue to move forward. Ever more important, isolation is a risk factor for suicide, and so we want to be very clear that we are addressing this even from a distance. You can explore a bunch of information on the slide. I can actually, Erica, if you move to the next slide, if people want to at least type that in and visit the Hope Policy Academy website that houses a bunch of this.
So many folks chiming in to say thank you and express their appreciation. We would have time for a question or two more if somebody has something they would want to share via chat. Okay, so Tessa is wondering, how do we support kids of blended families where custody arrangements are still being observed and so consistent routines are not possible? Lots to unpack about multiple households and many parents for sure.
Yeah, and my response is the same way we typically engage in this. This makes it even more complicated because now you're adding layers of different standards of precaution. So when we have blended families or families in multiple households, there are already rules that are different in households that you're starting to manage and you're trying to communicate. Now you're also adding a layer of precautions around these social distancing measures as well as stay at home, where one household may have a very different set of standards than another house. And this creates I've seen this create a lot of anxiety because if one household has stricter standards around these precautions, this is experienced as a very real threat to either their own exposure or to their child's exposure to contracting this virus and the potential impacts around that. And so this requires, again, going back to those same standard practices of working in tandem with our families, whether they're in the same households or different households, and getting on the same page about how they can communicate about the differing, where they are congruent and aligned in their precautions, and then where they're incongruent or misaligned, and how that can create tension in families and what are best practice strategies or strategies that they can use to come together around that. Again, it's all complicated and it requires levels of engagement in both sets of family units. But I think it's ever more important because it's only adding to continued and amplified experiences of anxiety. That's a great question.
Yeah, and we're getting some very good questions into the chat. This is a resource question, and I'm not sure if any of you will be aware, but for youth who are homeless, not connected to a family, are there any resources that we're aware of to support them in their mental health in these challenging times?
So I'm not aware of any additional resources that are available. We have many resources available, in particular in the St. Louis area, for our unaccompanied youth. So I guess a clarifying question for our poster would be, if they're in St. Louis, are they connected to a school district? The school district should have a McKinney, so ACT liaison, so somebody who is over their department for students in transition. Each district should have a specific staff member who is appointed to that position and could help them in terms of district resources and supports, but also that person should be very well versed in the community resources for our youth, and in particular our youth who are unaccompanied.
And that's oh, I'm sorry.
To kind of feed off that also, but I think the other piece to that is that's the primary task, is how do we get them connected to the sports? Because addressing anxiety is unlikely to be very fruitful in the context of not having stable home, food, shelter, safety. Anxiety is actually a pretty functional and important emotional response and an emotional state to live in, because there are serious threats pending. So we want to be able to get them connected so we can address that and then see what's left over.
And I just wanted to clarify to Megan, the supports that you're referencing, that's a nationwide thing. That's not regionally. So regardless of where somebody may be joining us from the country, school districts should have a dedicated liaison.
Yes, the McKinney-Vento Act is a federal act, so it does apply to every district.
Great.
And I just want you to know that in the chat, I threw in there the link to where the information page is around all those resources. And then additionally, you'll get a PDF version of it.
So another good question coming in through the chat, social workers are very often on the front lines of responding to situations. Challenging situations just got even more challenging. How do we practice good self-care? How do we support each other? What thoughts would you share about that?
Yeah, I think it's ever more important. As social workers and people on the front line, we are highly susceptible to vicarious trauma. We are highly susceptible to experiences of burnout. And a big part of that is these are big problems and challenges with oftentimes not sufficient solutions. And so managing that in any context creates vulnerabilities for all of us in the work that we do. And I think that, again, it comes back to how do we reduce vulnerabilities to negative emotional experiences. And I know that it almost feels so overly simplistic to say self-care, but I think about it as reducing vulnerabilities. This means that we've got to take care of our bodies in the service of long-term, but we also have to know when we need breaks. We need to know when we need to have distance. We need to know when we need to pass the torch so that someone else can pick up and help you so that you can disengage to heal so you can come back to this. This is a marathon. We cannot override our physical and emotional spaces in this short run trying to respond to all the crises. So we need, one, strong teams to be able to do that. Two, our own capacity to know what our limits are. The more we push our limits, the less effective we are. The more we push our limits, the more we make actual mistakes. And so part of it is also that ethical responsibility to know when I need to ask for help. And I think in general, as social workers, we're amazing at being compassionate to others, and we're not very good at being so compassionate to ourselves. But a part of this is that competency is learning to be able to do that. And again, it goes back to the same principles that we would be teaching our clients in these spaces. Regular bedtimes and routines, eating, exercising, and ensuring that we stay connected to the people and in our lives, the spiritual and our faith communities in ways in which that we can feel connected and still seen, and also really embed ourselves in our cultural traditions of healing and coming together.
Great. Well, we're coming up towards time. I want to pause and give the panelists an opportunity to offer any closing comments that they'd like to. Anything that you'd like to send us out with?
I'd like to say I just added to the chat, there's an excellent resource called Trauma Stewardship. It's a book. I actually use this when I work with my incoming Brown School students, my entry-level social workers. To Ryan's point, it has excellent activities, tips, resources. It really validates the difficult work that we do as support professionals, no matter what your support area is. So I think it's important to remember that, again, we are experiencing something that is highly difficult as well, and to take care of ourselves. So I'll also add the author's name in the chat before this is over, so folks can find this book. I highly recommend it.
Megan, did you want to say something and I'll wrap it up?
Yeah, just a quick thank you for the work that you're doing. It cannot be undermined that you all are most likely the most critical people in the work that's being done, and our families, they recognize it. We know that they are missing us and we are missing them, and it's okay to process that and acknowledge it. Part of this whole idea of self-care is not just saying, yeah, I need to tap out, but realizing that it's okay to do that. Doesn't make you less of a professional. In fact, it makes you that much stronger. So thank you all for the work that you're doing for our kiddos and their families.
Yeah, and to echo what Megan is saying, there's nothing more important than the work that many of us are doing, and it's never more important. And we're gonna face new, unique challenges, but I think also reminding ourselves that if you work in a school-based setting, you're dealing with a brand new set of standards on a daily basis, and you're used to pivoting, you're used to solving problems, you're used to being able to overcome adversity in a way that is really, really powerful. And I also recognize that there's limitations, and there's a lot of work that our communities need to be doing, and we need to be working in tandem in order to really create the structures and systems to truly fully support all of our families in our communities, and not just some and not others. And so I thank you for taking this time on a Tuesday in mid-afternoon to spend some time with us and my fellow colleagues. And I hope that this information is a great starter and a way to launch some more of your work, but also just a reconnection and reminder that we do know how to handle this. We do know how to address this, and we do it every day. It's just a new context that we're gonna have to just think about how all those same strategies fit, but it's just slightly contextually different.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Megan, for joining us today on Open Classroom and sharing this information. Really helpful reminders of basics, and then also providing context for how it's never been more important than right now to rely on and have confidence in our competency as professionals. Appreciate our audience joining us. As always, I want to share just a couple of program notes, other Open Classroom events coming up. We recently added a special Wednesday 4 p.m. That's not our standard time slot, but we're partnering with the Center for Mental Health Services Research and bringing Daryl Hudson from the Brown School faculty in to talk about Black-white differences in depression. That's his area of academic research, and he's got some fascinating insights to share. So please visit our free resources webpage, and still plenty of time to sign up and join us on tomorrow afternoon. And then we'll be back in our regular scheduled time slot on Thursday at 12:30 when Dan Ferris and Atia Thurman will be presenting Translating Research for Policy. So hope to see you all then. Please stay healthy and safe, and we look forward to seeing you at another Open Classroom very soon. Thanks all.